This is the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival. And now, please welcome author and journalist Jini Reddy, here to talk with Julia Wheeler.
Hello and welcome to the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting Stanford's in this way. And thank you today for coming with us on what promises to be a rather magical mystery tour in the company of Jini Reddy, who has written the book Wanderland. Jini, thanks so much for being here with us today and welcome to Stanford's.
Thank you very much for having me.
You say at the beginning of this book that your guides, if you like, for your journey are a mixture of serendipity and an inner compass. I wonder how those two things worked together, you felt, by the end of the journey.
Wow, that's a really big question to unpack. I kind of feel I need to give it some context for people who are not familiar with the book. So I had been a travel writer for some time, and on my travels, I'd had opportunities to meet people from indigenous cultures. And I was always struck by the way that for these people, it was perfectly natural to enter into this reverential, reciprocal relationship with the forces of nature. And I found this quite fascinating and magical, and I wanted to know if I too might be able to experience the landscape in this way. So this was kind of the seed for the journey. So it wasn't a kind of going from A to B using a compass or a map. I mean, there was a little bit of mapping involved, but mainly it was I wanted to enter into the spirit fully of my endeavor, and so that required relying on a different kind of compass. And so intuition came into it, and it's very, very difficult. Intuition and trust, and I guess, this sounds quite esoteric, I suppose, an invoking of the spirit of the land, whatever that might be. And I wasn't entirely sure what I meant by that, to guide me. And I think it's quite challenging because we're so used to talking about things in rational terms, that when we talk about an animate nature or connecting with an animate nature in the way that indigenous cultures do, it starts to sound quite a little bit vague. But it is the antithesis of the rational mindset, but no less rich and meaningful and for it.
In so much travel writing, there is, by dint of it being a journey, there's an objective, there's a place to get to. And I wonder perhaps also if that makes actually a really good book, because you've got that hero's journey where somebody is starting out, going along the journey, and eventually they meet their objective. But in your book, you're not actually sure quite what you are seeking at the beginning. You haven't got a particular objective in mind, have you?
Yeah, I wasn't approaching it as an expert or as somebody with a specific goal. I really wanted to open myself up, and I was approaching it as somebody who was asking questions. So I was very much a student of what I was doing, and I really enjoy journeying in that way. And even as a travel writer, I enjoy traveling in that way. Asking questions, opening myself up, trying to expand my field of perception a little bit.
Another theme that really runs through the book and that sort of runs parallel to this exploration is the idea of otherness. You talk in the book about being a perennial outsider. I wonder if you just talk to us a little bit about that and where that comes from inside you.
Well, I come from a multicultural background. I was born in the UK, raised in Canada. My mum and dad are Indian from South Africa. So I always live with a sense of feeling a little bit like an outsider wherever I am. But that's normalized for me. So in a way, that's the space in which I feel like I belong. And because I was exploring in the book, I was exploring the other in the landscape. And because I was writing about it through my gaze, it was natural that my own experience of otherness kind of came into it. So you're asking how I feel on the inside. I think there is a feeling sometimes of difference, I guess, because I I have a few windows in which to look upon the world, and it's not necessarily the dominant gaze. And it manifests itself sometimes when I'm traveling, sometimes when I'm in the countryside and I don't see other people who look like me. You know, I can feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it doesn't. But that sits alongside with my enthusiasm and my joy. So it's a very complex thing. I don't think these are things that can be easily encapsulated in sound bites.
No, but it's I find it very interesting to look through that prism, and you know, to walk in your shoes, which is exactly what we're doing in this in Wanderland. I wonder, in terms of nature writing, if that move when you were, I think, 7 years old, from the UK to Canada, and you know, rural Canada, which must have been so different, whether that being dropped in that space actually made you much more aware of nature and the differences, compared to somebody who had perhaps been born in Canada and grown up in that wonderful environment.
Well, I was quite young when I moved. I was 7, and I moved from Wimbledon, which, you know, has its beautiful green spaces too. But it was a huge, it had a huge impact on me. You know, suddenly I was surrounded by wilderness. We moved to a very small village. In fact, you could probably call it more of a settlement in the Laurentian Mountains, and I was surrounded by wilderness. You know, I had a pair of snowshoes, I had cross-country skis. There were very few people around, and yeah, so it had a huge impact in associating, I guess, nature with wonder. And so I saw it as something really positive, and my life changed in a very big way when we moved to Canada. Everything became lighter, metaphorically and literally. I just remember so much sunlight. You know, I think we arrived in a blizzard, but the next day it was, you know, gorgeous sunlight. Um, but I think all Canadians, or at least the ones I know, you know, really appreciate the nature around them, because the landscape's so big and the seasons are so defined. You're kind of very much in tune with nature. You can't really separate yourself from it in the way that maybe you can if the climate is kind of, you know, more even.
One of the things that jumped out at me was this idea of sugaring off, which for a 7-8-year-old person must have been absolutely wonderful. Tell us about sugaring off and what that is.
That's a custom, a Quebec custom, and it involves going into the woods, and you know, the trees are tapped for maple syrup. So it's all set up. So you go out with your school group, I guess. You take a bus, you go into the woods, and the trees are tapped for sap, and then the sap is put on little on snow, packed snow, and then you eat it as snow cones. So it's sort of like sweet snow cones, and there's a whole feast around it. And then you go into a big cabin and you have a giant feast, and there's a little disco, and you know, it's a whole day out for kids. It's great.
Sounds like the very best kind of school trip. Let's come to your journey then, and you start by thinking, you know, what is it that you're looking for, and you come across something called the worldwide labyrinth locator, which sounds mystical. Tell us about that, and tell us about labyrinths more generally, the ones that you went to.
Well, I'm not some kind of labyrinth expert, but I have walked a few, once in Croatia, once I think in somewhere in Sussex, and like I say, I was open to ideas and to inspiration. And I remember seeing a labyrinth painted on the wall of one of the tubes in London, and that got me thinking. And so I started Googling, and then this worldwide labyrinth locator came up, and basically it's a website showcasing labyrinths from around the world. And so I kind of tumbled down this wormhole and started looking at all these labyrinths, and they were in astonishing places, you know, on the edges of cliffs, on beaches, in woods, you know, beautiful outdoor, almost like outdoor temples. And then I came upon one in Cornwall, overlooking the sea, kind of on a diagonal, I guess. And I decided I wanted to go there, and I was going to go and walk this labyrinth. So that's how that came about. And when you walk a labyrinth, you're meant to ask a question. So unlike a maze is about losing yourself. A labyrinth is about finding yourself. And the idea is that if you walk the labyrinth, you ask a question, and with some luck, you might find an answer. Now, when I'd walked the labyrinths in Croatia and Sussex and elsewhere, I never experienced any answers, just a kind of self-consciousness. Here I am walking a labyrinth trying to find an answer, and nothing really happening. But I went in this, very open spirit. I was going to try again in Cornwall, and I went down there, and that's what I did. I had a question in mind.
Are you prepared to share the question and whether there was an answer?
I think the question was like a very open philosophical one, but it came deep from deep within me, because this was at the start of my journey. And it was, what do I mean by the magical? What am I seeking? What is this connection? Speak to me. I want tangible proof. If I'm writing a book about connecting with the spiritual dimension in the landscape, I want to feel that. I want to experience that. I want direct experience of that. Are you there? Is this possible? And on my first outing, well, I don't know that I did get the response I wanted, but as I carried on with my journeys, and I carried on with this in this spirit, and I was very dedicated and very sincere about what I was doing, and things began to happen. Synchronicities began to unfold, and I began to feel like I was experiencing this dialogue with the landscape. I think in the book I talk about it as a kind of pas de deux between myself and the landscape, and each of us speaking a different language, and trying to communicate. Coming to a middle point and trying to communicate, and really interesting things did begin to happen. And so that, for me, was the most incredible thing.
I wonder how much that is your open mindset and you seeing that happen, and how much it is, I don't really want to use the word reality, and I mean how other people would see that, because for example you have a treasure map in which you go down towards Hastings to find a spring, and the first time that you go, this is a spoiler, you don't find it, and then somebody says to you, well, maybe you weren't meant to find it. Now that is a mindset, isn't it? It's a kind of, is the universe talking to me? Do I need to be more in tune with it? Maybe there's a reason I didn't find it this time so that I can go back. And I just wonder how much of that is, and this is no bad thing, in our heads, a wonderful attitude that when it will be, and how much of it is real.
So I think I'm really grateful that you've asked this question. I think a lot of this idea that, it's a bit new agey, something to be slightly, a little whimsical, something to be dismissed a bit as your imagination. I think this is one of the legacies of colonialism, because the ways of indigenous people, that intuitive, deep feeling, that deep felt connection, the anthropologists of the era, the explorers of the era, they would have looked upon these beliefs as primitive and dismissed them and chronicled them as such. And that carries on, and it gets set in stone, and it gets carried down through the generations. And so it becomes second nature to dismiss anything that exists outside of what we in the West consider to be real. So that's kind of my answer to that. But actually, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter to me if somebody believes me or doesn't believe me. I had the experience, and it was joyful. And from my perspective, there's so much richness in experiencing the world in this way. If somebody chooses to be skeptical, that's their choice. I'm not trying to convert anybody.
I wonder what we do about that then, because or even if we need to do anything about it, is it sort of each to their own, take it or leave it, or actually would we all be, would the world be a better place, Jini? Here's a big question. Would the world be a bit better place if we were all a little more in touch with the universe, shall we say?
I think the world would be a better place if we were more open to other ways of perceiving and seeing and experiencing, generally being more open-minded, of course.
Let's, if you would take us to Herefordshire and a woman called Ellen with her belief in the old ways. What are the old ways?
Basically what I've just been talking about, this way of experiencing a deep connection with the land and believing in an animate, sentient nature and having a personal relationship with that. That was the context in which Ellen talked about it to me. And so I went up there to see, she calls herself a woman of the old ways, a shaman, and I went up partly because I wanted to see Herefordshire. I'd never been, and it seemed like a good idea. And I wanted I asked her if I could stay with her. I had actually met her at an event at the South Bank Centre to do with shamanism. And I went up and I spoke to her and I said, I'm writing this book, you sound quite interesting. Can I come up and stay with you? And maybe you could teach me something. Maybe I could learn something. And I think she was slightly taken aback, but she was open to the idea. So I went up and I stayed with her for a few days, but it was slightly awkward. And I realized, you can't just dial up these experiences. You can't, knowledge comes slowly. You can't just turn to somebody and say, give me your secrets. Tell me how it works. There's a kind of a slow process, an initiation. These things take months and years. So it was all slightly awkward at first. And then, she showed me some sacred sites. And eventually we went to this place called the Arthur Stone. And there was a whole ritual around this. And you were meant to crawl into the stone. And if you crawled into the stone, you could connect with the old ones. And I remember feeling really skeptical at this point. And it was a beautiful day. And all I wanted to do was go hiking. And here I was, about to crawl into this chamber. And I just was really self-conscious, and I was thinking, is anybody going to see me doing this? And, anyway, so I crawled into this chamber and I said to her, I had said to her before, what am I supposed to do when I get into this chamber? And she said, ask the old ones for a connection. And so I went into this chamber and very skeptically, and I was thinking, okay, I'm asking somebody, I don't know who you are, I'm asking for something, and sod it, I'll just make it up in my own head. I'll use my imagination. So basically I thought I was having this little daydream, this little fantasy, and then I came out and underwhelmed. And we went back to her house, and I decided to leave the next day because I thought, this is a bit silly, nothing's really happened. And I hadn't told her. I think I hadn't told her what had happened, what my experience had been. No, I had told her what my experience had been. And then she came down the next morning and she rushed downstairs, and there was an email from a woman across the world, and it was a really legitimate email. And this woman had a similar experience, and she had got in touch with Ellen to ask her what this, she could interpret it for her. And it was just the timing of it and the synchronicity of it that left me gobsmacked. And I know people will think, oh, well, this is a made up email, and it wasn't, and it happened, and it was incredible. So yeah, I'm aware that a lot of people will be listening to this and will be thinking, yeah, this is really silly. But these things happened. They happened, and they enriched my journey.
The Stampers audience is a very open, tolerant audience, I think. So I think they will be here wanting to find out more and weighing it up in their own minds. Ellen, the advice that she kind of finally gave you was to listen, which is obviously what you then carried on and took away through your whole journey. And you say that it could take years to understand the old ways, and actually similarly the ideas of many of the people that you met along the way. Was there any one in particular that you were more drawn to, and you thought, actually, yes, I could linger here, I could dawdle here, and I would like to become, for want of a better word, an expert in this?
I wasn't going into it with that intention. I wasn't trying to become a shaman or anything like that. I really just wanted to deepen and expand my way of experiencing the world. But I think there was one trip when I went to Iona in Scotland, in the Hebrides, and I decided I had done enough by this time that I wanted to kind of put my money where my mouth was, and I was going to ask the spirit of the land to guide me. I was going to go to Iona, and I was going to trust that I was going for a reason, and then that reason would be revealed to me. And on the way up, when I told this to a travel writer friend, he said, "What, you just going to rock up and be a bit spontaneous?" And he was really skeptical. And I said, "No, it is an intentional journey. It's different. It's different. It's almost like entering into the spirit of a pilgrim." And on the train up, on my email, there was a message from an acquaintance, and he said, "If you're going up to Iona, why don't you look for this mystical temple in the land and ask yourself, in what dimension does this temple exist?" And I was ecstatic. I thought, that's it. This is a clue. I've got my mission. I was just overjoyed to receive this information. And so I went to Iona with this intention that I was going to look for this land temple. And then when I got there, I turned myself into this amateur sleuth, and I was following crumbs, and I was asking people, but I was met with a lot of resistance. So either people thought I was making it up, or it didn't exist, or they showed it to me on a map and they told me it would be impossible to get there. And in the end, I got fed up, and I decided to let it go. And I was so frustrated. I thought, I'm just going to enjoy this beautiful island. And then on the very last day, I went into a cafe, and I bumped into a woman who I had met 3 years earlier at a conference in Scotland, just randomly. And I went up and I introduced myself again, and I said, "Do you remember me?" And this is why we got chatting, and I told her why I was here. And she said, "Well, why don't we try and find this together?" And I said, "Great." And we left the cafe, and as we left the cafe, she bumped into a woman that she hadn't seen for a year. And this woman was going for a walk, and we asked her where she was going for a walk, and she named this temple in the land. And my jaw just dropped. And not only that, she knew about it, and she offered to take us there. So I found it in the end. And to me, that was just the most incredible synchronicity.
I wonder what it does to us physiologically, actually, when something like that happens. I mean, I just you talking about that, I've got goosebumps thinking, how wonderful.
Oh, it was just, I was ecstatic. I mean, of everything. It came towards the end, when I had sort of like 2/3 of the way through, and I was just ecstatic. I felt I felt so high on life. And I felt, oh my God, what are the possibilities? What possibilities exist if we just expand our horizons, our field of perception? There's so much out there that we don't know. And I felt like I was getting the tiniest little glimpse of that. And imagine if you dedicated your whole life to something like this, what you might experience, and how your experience of life might be enhanced and might shift.
You meet also an older man on Iona who tells you to almost, my interpretation of it was, enjoy the journey rather than the destination. Go out there and wander, and actually there's magic everywhere you look.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, I was doing this, I wasn't blind to the beauty of the physical landscapes I was walking in. Of course, they were deeply nourishing, and I was kind of doing this along, the two together. It wasn't, I wasn't blind to the beauty or to the landscapes around me. I was very conscious of them and very, enjoying them as anybody would do. But I was doing the two side by side. But yes, of course, he's right. There's magic everywhere if you have the eyes to see.
You also undertake a pilgrimage, which is something that's perhaps more related to more established religions, shall we say, and you make a pilgrimage to St Michael's Mount with somebody who sounds great fun, actually, your friend Olivia, but she could walk, couldn't she? She was determined, Olivia.
Olivia is a really great friend, one of my closest friends, and she's Finnish, part American, and she's super fit, and she loves to walk, and she is a lot fitter than I am. So initially, and she has said to me in the past, I have this issue with time, and she feels like she doesn't have enough time, so she always wants to go very fast, and I'm the opposite. I wanted to go very slowly. And so we were trying to work out how to navigate this, and it worked out fine in the end. We're close enough, and we understand each other well enough that we were able to walk at the same pace. And that was interesting. Again, we went into it with a very open. Both of us went into it with a very open spirit, and it wasn't. We weren't sure what we were going to find or what might happen, but we were open. I think that's the key, is not to have a preconceived idea of anything, but to be open and to ask and to trust. And these are things we're not necessarily used to doing. We're used to having this kind of laser gaze, these ideas, these very clear ideas. I want to go here. I want to have this happen. I want to do that. I want to tick this off. And this is the antithesis of that. And I every single journey that I've made in this spirit has been infinitely more interesting, and in a tangible way, and infinitely more enriching than when I go with these set ideas of what I want to have happen. Things reveal themselves that otherwise wouldn't have. That's my feeling.
Part of it is all about slowing down. So actually, you wanting to do that walk slowly, and later in the book you go to meet somebody who's a tree whisperer, and she really is all about slowing down, isn't she? The idea is a sort of tree psychotherapy, isn't it, where you sit and regard a tree, perhaps talk to a tree, and see what it gives you back.
Yeah, so this was Glennie Kindred, and she's based in Derbyshire, and she's the most wonderful woman, and she's intimately connected with trees and with the seasons, and she is a font of knowledge about tree lore. And so I wanted to know if I could draw a little bit closer to trees through her and to experience them through her eyes. And so it's kind of like a kind of tree psychotherapy, I guess you could call it. And so we went into the woods, not far from her home, and she encouraged me to sort of stand in front of a tree and consider it with all of my senses and to see what I might pick up. So a lot of this, again, is very intuitive, but it was interesting. Some of the qualities, I can't remember which tree it was particularly, but I would pick up a quality. I would just sense something, as any of us might do, and she would say, yes, that does chime with this particular tree. So that was interesting. Her depth of knowledge was so great, and this was just a little glimpse for me. But it was fascinating to experience trees in that way. And I think, again, you would need to really slow down. I mean, I'm not somebody who is able to slow down to that degree, and you would need to persist and stay with it, I think. So that was one of the ones I found a little harder to connect with. But she also does she had a very interesting practice with these ogham sticks. She whittles the sticks, different kinds of wood from different kinds of tree, and she uses it as a kind of oracle. And that was fascinating, just the making of it, the meditation that goes on with it, the craft work. Really an interesting practice.
One of the places in England, certainly, that is sort of seen as full of mysticism, really, is Glastonbury. So we must just take a detour to Glastonbury, full of mysticism, possibly apart from a weekend in June when it's a completely different place. You went there off season. What did you make of it?
Oh yeah, okay, Glastonbury. I was overwhelmed by the high street. I mean, it was like this sort of temple to spiritual consumerism, and I found myself feeling slightly overwhelmed by it and wondering what exactly was I doing here. this wasn't exactly what I had intended. I wanted to experience a bit more of the authentic spirituality of Glastonbury and its landscapes. And so I decided to go for a walk, and I walked up to the top of the tor, and then I came down, and I met somebody I knew, and he suggested I meet a friend of his who was a kind of worshipper of the goddess, so the feminine deity. And she took me for a walk through Chalicewell Gardens, and she talked about her practice, and then she took me to this other temple, which was kind of the antithesis of Chalicewell Gardens, and it was a kind of it had a very dark feeling to it, and it was representative of the underworld, of the parts of ourselves that we repress, and it was very dark and kind of eerie, and we walked through this, and I just couldn't believe this place existed. I mean, for people who live in Glastonbury, I'm sure they're very familiar with it, but for me it was a very unusual place to enter. It was kind of felt to me like this sort of temple of darkness in a way. But it's not dark, it's the darkness inside us. It's not something evil or anything. So yeah, that was what that was about. But then when I was in Glastonbury, I walked into a shop. I just saw this shop and I decided to walk into it. It was an art gallery, a very small art gallery. And I was looking at the paintings, and I noticed a book, and the book was called The Glastonbury Zodiac. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I started talking to the shop owner, who was an artist, and he said, you might find something interesting in this. And so I went away with this book, and I discovered that you could. There was a sort of, people believe that there was a kind of zodiac in the landscape, the signs of the zodiac embedded in features in the landscape, which I thought was incredibly wild. And I met somebody a few months later in Glastonbury, and he took me on a walk through the zodiac, through one aspect of the zodiac. And that was interesting, but I found that really hard to wrap my head around. I felt like, okay, I feel like a skeptic. And now I know how it is to feel to be in the other person's shoes. But we got to a point. I was really frustrated on that walk, but then we got to a point, and it was a beautiful waterfall, and the sunlight was streaming in, and I thought, maybe this is all I need. Maybe this is enough.
Yeah, and what a gift! Absolutely. You say in the book that you are not drawn really to the whole Arthurian legend, to Merlin and so on, and equally you're not really drawn to the myths and legends of India, which is your heritage, your parents' heritage. What is it that doesn't chime for you with those, and where do you think that might come from?
Well, I think there was a conversation in my head about the mystical, a kind of magic and mysticism is a kind of universal thing that anybody could tap into, and you didn't have to have any kind of a priori knowledge. Whereas these myths and the lore, they seem to, you seem to need to understand these stories and interpret them, and they seem to be linked with very specific characters and specific outcomes. And to me, that felt too claustrophobic. It always feels to me too claustrophobic. Whereas with the magical and with the mysticism, you can have a direct experience of something. You don't have to sort of navigate through these myths, as it were. You don't have to be experiencing something through these myths. You can experience it directly, and I think that's what I grappled with. They just don't chime with me. None of the stories chime with me, so I think that's something in me. I think on a personal level, I'm just not interested in them. I'm interested in direct experience, and in a very personal thing. I mean, I like reading other things, but maybe not that.
That personal experience really comes through within the book, and you write often. I mean, you write very movingly, but from a place of vulnerability. It moved me when you felt othered in the church. It moved me when you felt othered because you didn't want to go into a pub. Tell us about that.
Well, I decided if I was going to write this book, I wanted to be really honest, and that means being vulnerable, which is not always easy to do because it comes back to you later and people ask you questions and then you have to be vulnerable again. But pub, okay. So if I'm in the countryside, I'm aware that there are not many people who look like me around, and when I'm on the threshold of a pub, I'm wondering how will I be received when I walk into the pub. I mean, this is something that is normalized for me in the countryside, and I've never had any unhappy experiences. I've never actually felt any kind of overt racism or anything like that, but the discomfort is there, because I'm aware that I walk in, and especially if I'm walking in somewhere on my own, people are not used to seeing a brown woman on her own walking into a rural pub. So I'm aware of being clocked, and there's a discomfort for me in that. But it doesn't mean I'm going to leave, or it doesn't mean I'm not going to have my meal, or I'm not going to be there and be with it. So those experiences are part of my reality. But as I say, I was a travel writer for a long time. I'm used to being somewhere different. I'm used to being an outsider, as anybody who travels, is. So it's kind of an extension of that for me. It's not going to the countryside isn't some great daunting expedition into the unknown. It's a different landscape that I'm traversing. And I carry those things with me, but they are part of my experience, my life. I think this is one of the reasons why we need more diversity within travel writing, because otherwise we're only experiencing things through a single gaze, a single story. And the world has many voices, and we're all richer for hearing more of them.
So let's talk about that diversity, Jini, within travel writing, because it was actually at Stanford, wasn't it, where you discovered that there was more to travel writing than you'd imagined in terms of the white man, hero, journey, objective. Tell us about who you found on those bookshelves in Stanford's.
Okay, well, I think the very first travel book I ever read was when I was at university, and it was Pico Iyer's Video Night in Kathmandu. And I remember being astonished that here was this man. He was Indian. He was born in Britain. He was living in California, and he had a book published. And I think I was more impressed by that than I was, the actual book. I kept wondering, how did he make this happen? And then when I came back to Britain from Canada, I remember finding Stanford's, and I would spend hours in there. And I think I came across a book by Eddie L. Harris, and it was, I'm trying to remember the title now. I've got it on my shelf. A Native Stranger. That's what it's called. And he walks across. He travels across Africa. And he was the tale of a black man seeking to discover his relationship with Africa, whatever it might be, with the countries he traveled in Africa. And then there was a book by an Iranian woman called Lipstick Jihad, and she was American Iranian, and I love that kind of she's American and she's Iranian, and she's writing about her life and her time in America and in Iran, and just these sort of, I think Pico Iyer called them cross-cultural anomalies and feelings of exile, and I love that with these sorts of writers this was coming out, and I could really relate to that. But at the same time, I liked, when I was younger, I worked at Penguin Books, and I remember reading books by people like Jason Eliot, An Unexpected Light, and William Dalrymple's City of Gins. And I remember Rory Stewart's book, Places in Between. So I read a lot of those traditional books, Ryszard Kapuscinski's The Shadow of the Sun, Desert Places and Tracks by Robin Davison. So I read a lot of the traditional stuff as well. But I really liked it when I came across something that I could connect with more personally. But another book I wanted to mention was, and it's never been marketed as a travel book. It was published in 2019 and I came to it recently, Paean by Johnny Pitts. And he travels, he's mixed race, and he travels across Europe in search of this idea of Afropia. And I was blown away by this book, and I definitely recommend. It's one I recommend.
Yeah, I think that the travel genre and the genres that bump up against that give so much potential, don't they, for, I don't know whether the right phrase is crossover non-fiction, but the nature writing, for example, and the travel fiction, you know, that's just there's a world waiting to explode there.
I think it's incredibly rich, and I hate these labels. You know, I'm all for mixing genres. A lot of the nature writing that I really enjoy is fiction. Richard Powers' The Overstory, Melissa Harrison's novels, At Hawthorne Time. You know, even Delia Owens, Where the Crawdads Sing. You know, I love fiction. I adore fiction, and I adore nonfiction that's well written. And I'm so bored of these labels that we put on things. You know, this is travel, or this is nature writing, or this isn't, or there's just good writing. It's just good writing and bad writing, I guess.
That sums it up, and that's the perfect place to leave it. What a celebration of wonderful writing. Jini, thanks so much for being here at Stanford's with us today. Thank you to everyone who's watched and learned along the way in this session. I think we're all a lot more open than we were at the beginning of this 45 minutes, Jini. So thank you for making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I love St Michael's Mount. I haven't been for years, and now I've got a real hankering to go. Well, openness has been a recurring theme at the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival now for many years. Cancelling the hotel, ripping up the itinerary, and getting out of your comfort zone. Well, whilst I'm afraid we can't help find your inner compass, we can source you a magnetic one. Stanford's are the UK's leading specialist retailer of maps, travel books, globes, and accessories for explorers. And Wanderland by Jini Reddy is available there now at stanfords.co.uk.